Hello, everybody. My name is Professor Judith Hawley, and I'm the chair for the fifth in our current series of London Luminaries lectures. In the past, we've had a theme for each of our talks, but more recently, we've left it up to our partners to decide what they want to highlight. They have chosen stories about people, places, and objects that make their houses and sites significant and worth visiting. We're very pleased now to welcome back Turner's House, which has a story to tell about how they interpret their very special site for contemporary visitors. So tonight we have two speakers for the price of one. The first is Lucy Littlewood, who is the chair of Turner's House Trust, as well as being director of the American Museum and Gardens in Bath. She's been very busy at the moment, as you might imagine. She'll be introducing a second speaker, the poet and creative director Thomas Sharp, whose work you'll recognise from numerous cultural institutions across London and had an input in the reinterpretation of J.M.W. Turner's Sandycombe Lodge. Now, there'll be a short transition between the two, but don't worry about it. So over to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Judith. We're delighted to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So delighted to be here. And as Judith said, we're talking about how we brought the sort of personality of Turner the man back into the lodge following the faithful restoration with which I think many of you are familiar with. So over the course of the next few moments, we'll talk a little bit, recap a little bit on that physical restoration, but also focus on how we actually brought his personality back and what the building told us about that and what our approach was as a team. So you'll all be, I think, hopefully recognise this beautiful villa on Sandycombe Lodge, Sandycombe Road in St Margaret's. It's officially in Twickenham, but it's very walkable from Richmond. It did look like this not that long ago. I'm not going to dwell this evening on the house's history or its renovation, but it's worth noting, I think, that since the early 1800s and Turner's time, it has had many owners, including in World War II. It became a shadow factory where airmen's goggles were made. Sadly, the heavy sewing machines damaged the house quite badly, and it was in a poor state when in 1947 it was bought by Professor Harold Livermore and his wife Anne. They were really careful custodians of the house, and they loved Turner and they collected art relating to him and his time. In the 1950s, they secured Grade 2 listing for the building, and Professor Livermore set up the Sandycombe Lodge Trust, now Turner's House Trust. And on his death at the age of 95 in 2010, the Trust became the owner of Sandycombe under the wonderful leadership of local art historian Catherine Parry Wingfield. And this was following a chance encounter with the professor in St Margaret's Post Office queue. We're hugely fortunate that we have sketches by Turner himself, some of which are incredibly detailed, and some by contemporary artist William Haval. So the conservation team made the decision to return the house to as close as it was, as close as possible. The sketches provided an extraordinary insight into Turner's mind at the time and give us a real glimpse of his personality as well, but more of that in a moment. We also see many hints in the house that his friend John Sown was part of this design and build process. You'll note the classic arches, curved walls and architectural features that echo his other work in the Bank of England or his own house in Bloomsbury. We've got letters from Turner's friends that reference his model boats, artworks from up-and-coming artist friends, and describe the dinners, cutlery and food, as well as the convivial atmosphere. So we've got hints as to how he might have lived there, but I'm jumping ahead a little bit. But this type of information allowed a near faithful interpretation in the conservation and restoration phase. Later added upstairs bedrooms and the white stucco were removed from the outside of the building. Furniture was purchased based on inventories from his other Chelsea and Marylebone properties, and paint fragments allowed the team to unearth this wonderful pink wall and fashionable mock marble paintwork in the hallway. We were privileged to work with Kew on an interpretation of planting from the period. The garden would, of course, have been much, much larger, reaching down to the river where Turner and his father so liked to fish. And we know it contained a well and a holding pond where their fish would be kept until supper time. So another insight into how they lived in the house. We do know that this was a place of retreat, a base for their fishing with his old dad, but it was also a social place for conversation and cultural debate with his fellow creative, some of whom lived locally. in what was already a fashionable area of Richmond. This group he referred to as the Academicals. And actually, this is the name that we've now chosen to call our ambassadors or patrons. And we too are planning an annual picnic for them to look back and remember how Turner entertained there. This to me is an important moment to reflect on Turner's personality. He was in his early 30s when he lived here, but he was already financially successful, spending extensive periods staying at places like Petworth or the grand homes of his patrons. And yet he chose to build Sandycombe Lodge. It was no doubt a convivial space, but it certainly wasn't big enough to offer reciprocal stays or host large house parties. So he chose a fashionable area. He invested in supreme design details, fashionable interiors, fashionable furniture, yet it was incredibly modest in scale. So perhaps the word retreat does best convey this. And that's perhaps what we learn most about his personality from the outside, for sure. Turner's often portrayed as not being a family man, but his father, William, or Old Dad, was his closest aide and companion. And indeed, it is thought that Sandycombe Lodge was built for him. Certainly, he lived here full time and was at home here. Does this hint at a softer, more familial side to Turner's personality? I mentioned the detailed sketches earlier. Turner was certainly quirky and I think quite fun. What was he thinking with this window, which looks like an error? Or was it deliberate? Was this idea of Turner and John Sown having a bit of a laugh? Why are there two doors into his bedroom? Was this originally meant to be a wall between them? And despite changing his mind, he didn't want to spend the money having one removed. Cupboards are off centre. Things aren't symmetrical. Was this all part of his quirky personality? Or does it hint of a slight financial meanness in not wanting to correct errors? There's also suggestions that he was highly fashionable. This carpet looks almost Versace, doesn't it? How cool is this? It closely resembles a carpet found at One Royal Crescent here in Bath, where I'm speaking from. It's also interesting to note, and I love this, when we recreated the wallpaper in his bedroom from a found fragment, just reminding you what the bedroom wallpaper looks like, it turns out it's the very same that was found in Jane Austen's bedroom. Both, of course, 250 anniversaries last year for them. I don't want to spark any rumours, but did Jane Austen and Turner meet? So all of this was the physical observations of Turner from a brilliant conservation and restoration team and from those sketches. They got the house back to perhaps the day Turner moved in. But I was intrigued about how did he live in the house. I'm sure it wasn't as tidy and clean and fragrant, and I'm sure his bed wasn't hospital cornered neatly and tidy. So whilst it was a perfect restoration, could we explore how he and Old Dad lived there? We've got a super but small team at the house, 4 part-time staff, and a brilliant board. The trustee body contains some of the world's most respected Turner experts and art historians, Nicola Morby, Gillian Forrester, Franny Moyle and Guy Peppiatt. But would they agree on who Turner was as an inhabitant? And did the board all have the same views on his personality? So for chapter 2 of the restoration, I, as the chair, gathered the board and staff together for an away day to ask the questions. Why is it important and relevant that Sandycombe Lodge exists in this state, open to the public, and how do we convey those reasons? Was it his largest artwork? Was it there as a memorial to him? Or was it somewhere to be used as he used it, for conversation and dialogue and sharing local artwork? As a storyteller, I find it really helpful to start with words and create a compelling narrative that strategy and interpretation can then flow from. Often people start with a necessity or a need and a strategy and then try and fit the words around it. I like to start with the words. So I enlisted the best I know in the industry for helping unlock magic through words. And I thought it would be fun this evening to invite him along to share with you what he can bring to organisations at sticky moments like this.
Thank you, Lucy. Hi, as Lucy said, I'm Thomas. I'm actually talking to you as luminary fans. I'm talking to you from Brantwood in Coniston, home of Ruskin. As I'm sure lots of you know, I'm staying here for a few days. And although I might be in silhouette, I thought it would be far more interesting for everybody to see the sun set slowly over Old Man just behind me and over Coniston than see my face. And so, as Lucy said, I was really honoured to be brought in to talk to the board, and what a board on Turner's House it is. All those amazing people with so much knowledge of Turner and his personality. But my experience as a poet and as a creative director who works with organisations on their language and their writing, my experience is about how do we take those stories, take those narratives we all know, and how do we do interesting things with them that is going to help us reach our audiences. So what I'm going to show you over the next 5 or so minutes is just some of the projects I've worked on that are separate from Turner's House, but really it's very much the brief presentation I gave to the board as we began to think about telling Turner's story differently. So just briefly, these are just some of the actual clients that I have. Real big mix. I work with lots of cultural organisations as well as lots of quite commercial organisations. So you've kind of got your V&A and your Google, British Library, Bank of England, Design Museum, Historic Royal Palaces. So real kind of mix. The story and the challenge is always the same, whatever organisation I go in and I work with. It's always how do you encapsulate all the things that an organisation does, all the stories, all the narratives. How do you really boil those things down to create messaging that will go out there and will get people interested in what we're doing? I've not met an organisation yet that doesn't have that same challenge, and of course it is the same with Turner's. So as a poet, I work half my time on artistic projects and half my time on commercial projects. Actually, I think it's always really important when you're thinking and working on the commercial projects to think about the language and the writing, to think as artistically as possible. And so that's briefly what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about 5 ways to think about an organisation's writing. And I'm sure lots and lots of people in the audience this evening will be involved in telling the stories of the places that they know well. And sometimes you find that organisations and places kind of fall into a trap of telling a story about their organisation or their brand or their place in the same way that everybody else does. And of course, that doesn't do anybody any favours. And so these 5 ways are all about how to kind of jolt ourselves out of that, with some examples of some projects I've worked on. So the first way I'm going to talk about is that when we're telling a story, very detailed is always interesting. Sometimes when people are telling stories about organisations, there's a tendency to kind of smooth everything, to make everything as broad as possible, to give kind of the big top notes. But actually you find that to reach audiences, the more detailed you can be, the more interesting you can be. And sometimes people are scared about being super detailed because they feel that the minutiae of a place isn't going to appeal to everybody. And whilst that is true in one sense, I also think that even if people don't understand the minutiae that they're reading, they still get a sense of the overall brand. So here's a really good example, and this is a piece I did for the British Library. And this was in the massive space, a huge banner in the massive space, the British Library as you walk in. And it's about research. It's about all the different ways that you can research. So there are 3 slightly longer pieces in my brief presentation. I'm going to read to you. So I'm going to read this out. If it happens in the library, it's research. Jotting down snippets of Sunderland history, research. Working with a friend on the science of lichen, research. Idling through the exhibition space, research. Ordering from our Yorkshire vaults a Daily Mirror published on the bright morning you were born, research. Coffee and gossip, they did what? Research. Buying yet another small red notebook, research. Emailing our business team for help finding all the weavers in Cornwall, research. Scrolling through Twitter, real-time research into Marshall McLuhan's concept of the gravitational effect on cognition caused by new technologies. Enjoying a nice sit and a gentle think, research. Learning about your cat's intermittent signalling of the laryngeal and diaphragmatic muscles, and I'm afraid I can't roll my R's here, so you're going to have to imagine, research. Requesting a 1989 thesis on the comeback of the French chanteur, research. Being here with hundreds of other curious, wonderful, wondering humans. with those who are new to our island and with those who are old hands, with librarians and readers and challengers and dreamers, research into a big, open, shared future. Welcome to the British Library. And this is a really good example of an organisation being unafraid to be hyper detailed in the story that they put out there. So all of those details, all of those different kind of references, Marshall McLuhan, cats purring, Serge Gainsbourg, Daily Mirror on the day you were born, it's all very hyper specific, but actually when you put them together, they tell us this bigger story about what you can do with the British Library. Simultaneously to that, I had this piece running as a huge billboard just outside the British Library. Shops, cafes, the whole wealth of human knowledge, endeavour and experience to date, events, exhibitions. So that's kind of another example of how you can be hyper-specific about what an organisation does, but you can kind of maybe contrast with the slightly broader pieces. So the second is, can we make unusual comparisons and connections? And I'm going to show you a piece I've done for London Fire Brigade, and this is a piece that is above the fire station on Old Street, so the Shoreditch Fire Station, and it actually comes from a longer piece that I wrote for London Fire Brigade. It's been super successful. It's photographed all the time, and it's kind of been referenced lots. And what I wanted to do here was talk about London Fire Brigade, who also kind of need to fundraise for various things, but I wanted to make a connection that didn't feel like the emergency services. So in my mind, when I was writing this, I was thinking about a piece for the Fire Brigade, which would sound like a Nike ad. So this is very much in the spirit of a Nike ad. The running towards. And always some part of our pageant and alleyway city, our pudding lane city, our everyone welcome city is calling. And always there will be those running towards. A pounding of boots which says there are no others. An engine's hurrying growl which says we are only as safe as the most vulnerable amongst us. People are good. People gather their humanity in hot moments and step forward to help those they don't know. Wailing sirens, the newspapers say, as if all we hear is a desolate cry keening above the streets, rather than a protective call of reassurance, a community chorus of, we are running your way. What we do when we get there comes from training. Love is the running towards. So it's very much a piece that, as I said, is kind of in the spirit. You can imagine it almost being this kind of inspiring athlete type Nike ad. It's about bravery, it's about the individual, but transferred over to the fire brigade, it feels completely different. That was a really good example of kind of thinking about how you can be clever with unusual connections. When I was working with Turner's House, I was also working with a sofa and armchair company called Love Your Home. And I actually made that connection about having a Turner's House collection. And I think Lucy might be talking about that shortly. The third way to think about an organization's writing is, what's the one big truth? Every organization has one big truth. Saying that one big truth is scary because it means it feels like you're eliminating the other aspects of your story, but actually there's real power in just saying one thing very, very simply. A couple of examples. I did this piece for the Design Museum. Someday the other museums will be showing this stuff. So it's just 9 words. And that really is talking about the Design Museum as being ahead in terms of time from all of the other museums and collections, because they show the really, really contemporary stuff. And then another piece is for the Henry Moore Institute, which is the contemporary sculpture wing of the Henry Moore Foundation up in Leeds. This is, when the world demands toxic productivity, contemplation is a radical act. So that's taking the truth of looking at contemporary sculpture. It's describing it, not trying to sell the sculpture, not trying to sell specific artists or specific shows. It's just talking about the experience of contemplating contemporary sculpture, and that feeling almost like a radical act because it's not something that lots of people do. So finding that one simple truth is another way to tell a story. Fourth way, reflecting back people's needs. It's always worth thinking when you're talking from an organization's perspective about what do people want to hear. It's very easy for all of us to fall into the trap of just talking about the things that interest us, just selling our story and our narrative, and not actually thinking about how our presence exists in other people's lives. So this is an example of the Henry Moore Studios and Gardens, an advert, a series of adverts I created actually. There's quite a few in this range, and they all end with this line, Henry Moore knew how to live. On this particular advert, you can see at the top, co-founder of the CND, mushroom shapes on his horizon. If you've been to the studio gardens, you know that he has the sculptures in the space. It's a beautiful, beautiful space. The thinking behind this was thinking, why do people go to visit studios and gardens? Yes, they're interested in the artists. Yes, they're interested in looking at the architecture and the history and the art. But also, I think sometimes people visit places to connect with the luminaries who lived there. This is why I'm in Brantwood. I love John Ruskin. So to be in that space and to think about how my life might change from the inspiration of someone like Ruskin or Henry Moore, that is something I want. And I think lots of people go to visit places for that. So this is a campaign thinking specifically about what people want to draw from us, as opposed to the particular story we want to tell. And then finally, the final of the 5 ways to think about an organisation's writing is you can lead with emotion. It doesn't all have to be about facts. You can absolutely go to reach in and touch someone's heart. And I'm going to read you a slightly longer piece now that I did for St Martin in the Fields, which I'm sure you know is an absolutely amazing organisation, both with the work with the homeless and just the Church of the Ever Open Doors. And this is a piece that is written so it both appeals to people who have a spiritual, a religious connection with St Martin in the Fields, but also people who have no religion at all. There is a word. No, not that in the beginning one, though it begins much, ends much too. No, another, outwardly at least. It is a word which glitters, which fizzes on the tongue, which twinkles in your memory from a once when it was softly gifted to you in a vulnerable morning of your life, and now sparks like a portable star forever moving through the story of yourself. It is a word with charisma, a bright, shimmering, reflecting word, a word with brilliance jewelled within. It rings with courage and joy. Hear it in the Dimitiss, the Magnificat, the Trafalgar Square World Cup chant. And friends, it is a word we share today. When in our many-angled splendour we're accepting invitations, listen to your neighbour. This word, I'm sure, will shine from then. Because in this place, this word is given freely, given to fellow travellers in our ever-aching need. The simplest, smallest word as the biggest beacon to love and hope and love and love. So elemental there should be a square for it in the periodic table. So fundamental to the wider kindness the physicists could smash all their atoms into it and still it would hold sinlessly together as an indivisible force. Yes, this is the word yes. So much harder to say than no. It opens us up to whatever may follow. It unlatches the established door. It is a word which catches the light of what it is to be human. St Martin in the Fields, yes. And I had the great honour of Sir Simon Russell Beale actually performing this piece at various St Martin in the Fields events, and it was released as a print. And that's a really good example of writing for a brand which it leads on emotion. It's not trying to sell facts. It's explaining to you. It's bringing you along purely by touching your heart. That's me. Those are my details, which you're welcome to take a screenshot of, and I will hand back to Lucy.
I hope that was a glimpse into how, really starting with words and narratives, because in all those examples, the words came first and then the strategy and interpretation or advertising or fundraising campaigns followed. So Tom spent a brilliant day with us on the board, and it allowed us to really, we all had a different idea of what we wanted to do with Turner's House and what that would change. And these aren't Tom's words, these are mine, but what we then were able to do was come up with a vision, because the vision, as Tom referred to in the beginning, is people are tempted often to talk about historic. So the house was built in, or he lived here in, and sort of tell that historic story, when actually what's important about this house. So what we pulled out was the contradictions and complexities of Turner. And we felt he was this man of two sides, and that the house actually demonstrated that physically. So it was a place of refuge, but it's also a place of creativity and connection. And it was a space that mirrored his humble beginnings in its modesty, but it was this sort of fashionable house. So it did mirror that establishment fame that he later had. So we thought, how can we turn all that into our mission? And that enabled us to really think about new spaces, new use of the house, new programming, even a new staffing structure, and a really big increase on partnerships and events. So that all came from those words and that work on that day. Tom referenced the partnership with Love Your Home. And it was a partnership that was about furniture that was being made inspired by the architectural features of the house, But what it did is actually forced us to think as an organisation about how we use the space. Because bringing contemporary furniture into a space that had previously only been antique furniture or period furniture to Turner's time made us think about how Turner used it. So again, going back to those contradictions, the salon was always intended as a dwell space. It was somewhere where we looked at the view, where we might have been reading and conversation. So we've used this partnership to not only be financial, because obviously we get income from the furniture that's sold, but also it's transformed how we think about this space. And it now is a space that's filled with books and objects that can be read, handled, touched. And we're taking inspiration, of course, from how Turner would have used the room and who he would have invited in. So again, it started with words, then it led to a partnership, then it led to a rethink and a whole reorganisation of the space. With that new vision in mind, we really worked with the board and staff to explore other artists' homes and museums that could inspire us. So from one extreme, from Dennis Severs, which I'm sure you'll all know in East London, to my personal favourite, Rembrandt's house in Amsterdam. And we invited a team behind the beautiful reinterpretation of Wordsworth's Dove Cottage to present to us how they had worked on that lovely project. And this led initially to a very straightforward and really, really low cost revamp. And as I mentioned earlier, the house was a pristine recollection, I think, of the day that I think Turner moved in. So we've messed up the bed. We've added books, candles. There's a bedpan next to the bed. There's a water-filled washing bowl and a volunteer-made Turner shirts to drape around. We tea stained the cups and saucers. It's also worth noting at this point, we've had really cracking professional photographs taken, which has made such a difference. Thinking carefully about light at all times, which is obviously so important to Turner and part of our new brand. But also continuing the idea that we're getting a glimpse into Turner's world. We're wanting this idea that Turner has just gone fishing and you're almost trespassing on his home and he might come back at any moment. We added pans to the kitchen. These actually came from my kitchen. We've added real food and some homemade food by the staff, but we opted for real potatoes, real onions in a sack. They're muddy and that smell adds to the atmosphere. We've picked fresh flowers from the garden and bunches of dried herbs and they all add to that atmospheric smell. And we decided that financially we prefer to replace real food cheaply than have plastic. And ashes in the fire add to the scent too. Willow plates that we know that Turner had have been kindly donated, loaned by Ricky Pound, who may well be on the call tonight. I'm sure many of you will know him. So this physical additional interpretation that's really only cost us a few £100, thanks to gifts and loans and homemade additions from the staff and board and friends and that partnership, has really just given us that first step into sort of thinking that Turner is lurking round a corner. We have now won funding for the next stage, so we can really push this interpretation even further. But this was step one. Really big part about how we think about personality and think about a new narrative and a rebranding of the organisation was to think about our digital presence and our social media and how that also needs to replicate this new personality-led vision. So we're fortunate again to win funding, and using these new narrative themes, as you can see here, we focused on the wonderful windows in the house, and that helped us generate the new logo that you can see there with the T and the H sort of forming a window. We worked at the idea of glimpsing through the window into Turner's world, and we really worked on those ideas of contradiction. So the great outsider's inner world. We worked with 93 Feet in Sheffield, who made the website for us, and we worked with a super talented Stop Look Listen agency who developed the brand identity. You might have seen their work at Pallant House or St Albans Gallery, but really inventive. So again, here you can see we turned what had been the story of the house into the story of the man, but using the house as a vehicle for that, which I think is the biggest shift in thinking, really. And again, here, just some images of how we use that window logo. We use lighting and this beautiful photography, the restless mind finding quiet, the retreat, the revolutionary. So constantly talking about using language as in its contradictions, reclusive, visionary, and some ideas there for merch and our tube posters. All the shapes we used were mirroring architectural features and using the light, as I mentioned before, was really, really important, and new photography. So again, we're talking about website, brand, photography, use of rooms, all coming from this idea of personality and narrative. And the photographs really are crucial to that, and really, as I mentioned, using that idea of glimpsing and light. Not only changed what we look like physically in person in the house and online, it also influenced our events. So we're doing much more life drawing, watercolor classes, on plein air sessions, really using the house as Turner used it, making it feel lived in. We've added new tours into the schedule, so we're emphasizing different themes, and we're using different aspects of Turner's personality to lead those tours. This is going to be further expanded with a new fully costed reinterpretation. And one idea is that we pull out one side of Turner's character per room. For example, his friendships locally in the dining room, where we know they supped together, or relationship with his old dad in the kitchen. And we're fortunate that staff and volunteer training has also been included in our new funding pot. So the next steps, more interpretation, more sounds and smells and atmosphere creation along these themes of the man behind the easel. But some very creative thinking and willing, engaged teams has meant that we've made really great progress that's been very well received so far by the volunteers and visitors on a very small budget. So do pop in and see us.
Thank you so much, Lucy and Thomas. We're going to draw out some interesting themes from both of your presentations in a moment. But before we do, I just want to put in a plug for the remainder of our series. This is we're well over halfway through. We have 3 more talks from some of our long-standing partners, Marble Hill House, Ham House, and the William Morris Society, which I think will tie in with some of these themes to do with how we interpret the past. We've had one question, which is kind of cheesy, but it's I think it's also a really good one about what is both of you. Can you name what is your favourite aspect of this redesign, this rebrand? Is there an individual element, or is there a sort of an overall factor?
I mean, I'll just say that I think that the connection with a sofa and armchair designer was an unexpected result, and actually it led to lots of very thoughtful conversations, new people coming into the house, reinterpreting it. So that was just a beautiful thing to see happen.
I want that sofa. I mean, the National Trust has its Farrow and Ball series of colours too, so it's that's the kind of partnership that other people do too. Brilliant. And Lucy?
I think I love people's reactions when we came in. I was delighted by the volunteers' reactions when they came in. But I think for me, it is that slight sense of looking over my shoulder to think he's about to come back from fishing. And we've got, a bit more to go. The dining room, for example, we haven't really touched yet. But I love the tea stained cups and his ruffled bed that makes you sort of look like he's just crawled out of it. I mean, these are really simple things. These aren't groundbreaking. These are really simple things, but it's the atmosphere that they add is the beginning of a journny. I'm not saying this is absolutely as we would absolutely want it, but it's the beginning of a very exciting journey, and it does prove that with leading with exciting clarity over your vision and narrative, with not very much, you can start to bring personality to life.
I think that's a really lovely note to end on. Thank you, both of you, and good luck with your future projects. And I'm really looking forward to coming back to see Turner's House. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
And thank you, audience, for your excellent questions. Bye-bye.